Christian doesn't know about me is that I graduated from VTS in 2011, and while I was here, I was actually the president of the Rosary Society. Oh, I know. And I had a phone conversation several months ago with my good friend Phil Duvall from the class above me, and he said, Katie, you were like one of the most formal, reverent Anglo-Catholic people on this campus. How did you get from that to this? This is actually as formal as we get at the Abbey. We usually don't wear any vestments or have, it's usually a coffee table that serves as our altar. But it is a sort of an interesting point, you know, what does it mean to sort of go into the world and preach the gospel, and what draw does that have on us, whether we are, you know, sort of praise band centric or, you know, or Anglo-Catholic and Rosary Society oriented. When I graduated from seminary, I served several different churches, two sort of small, rural, poor parishes. And then went to St. Luke's in Birmingham, which is sort of as big and white and wealthy as you can possibly get. But the one thread for me that really stood out is the fact that in my experience in Alabama, it feels like we have lost an entire generation of people. And it's my generation. It's the millennials. It's the 30-year-olds that are just not there. And those of us who are still sitting in the pews in church, we're not even disenfranchised. We were never franchised to begin with. And just aren't feeling like, you know, we have the power or the spiritual authority or sort of the story of salvation behind us in order to take charge and take leadership in the church. We've got the priests, we've got millennial priests, but we don't have millennial deacons, and we don't have millennial lay leadership, which is the most important order of ministry anyway. And so a lot of the Abbey was conceived as, we are intergenerational, absolutely, but how do we really lift up, how do I help lift up people that are my own age? And one of the ways that we do that, really the primary way that we are trying to do that is by being a place that holds space for younger people, that holds space. You know, we can't necessarily like produce super awesome events or super awesome music, but we can hold that space, and we can hold it in a really hospitable way, which for us is by having really good coffee and really comfortable places to sit where people can come and reimagine and rediscover the Christian tradition. And part of that is also, as in the video, is not being Sunday morning centric. The Abbey's open 7 days a week. And we see people floating through and walking in on sort of these random, spontaneous spiritual conversations all week long. We were all really drawn, it felt like in this room, to Stephanie Speller's chart that she put up yesterday morning, right, of sort of the established church, quotes, you know, view of what church should look like versus the missional church. And what I really want to talk to you about this morning is the fact that making that mind shift from the established church to the missional church is not free. It costs something. And it costs both the established church something, and it costs the missioners something. It costs everyone in this room here something. And one of those things is how we redefine success. At VTS, I worked on my senior thesis with Dr. Ye, and I went to him the first day and said, I want to write about the speeches in the Acts of the Apostles, because Acts 2 just annoys me all to hell. Because Peter gets up and he gives this speech, and you know, it ends with, and on that day, 2,000 people were baptized, which makes me and my little group up here seem like an utter failure. And so as I was looking at the scriptures for this event, I discovered that actually back in the Gospel of Luke, Jesus gives a different perspective, where he says, remain in the same house. Don't move around from house to house. My husband, Josiah, and I, as we were serving at our big, sort of wealthy church called St. Luke's, surprisingly, found that established congregation, while it is full of wonderful people and wonderful clergy, the way they evaluate success, and I think this is true of many churches, is by numbers. Your ASA, or if we had a young adult event, well, how many people were there? How many people are being confirmed this Sunday? How much have we raised in pledges? And being the associate for young adults, just about everything we did, measured by that standard, failed. We tried parties, we tried barbecues, we tried beer and wine galore, stewardship events, beer and play and pizza on the lawn, and many a gimmicky Thursday night Bible study like The Hobbit and God. And it just didn't work. And so instead, we started taking one or two younger people at a time and inviting them over to our house for dinner. Not to the church, but like to our house. Let us cook for you. Let us pour you a glass of wine. Let us find out really authentically and deeply, who you are. And it worked. It's worked. And a lot of those young adults that we have invited over to our house for dinner are now part of the Abbey and our movement. This is a young adult EFM group that I mentor. And we sort of have about the same number of people, a dozen to 20, as part of our worshiping community. At the Abbey, we see, because we're open, 24/7, we probably see 400, 450 people a week. We see 12 at a time. Kind of a magical number, 12, right? But reevaluating success in that way, it costs something. One thing that our panel, I'm sure, will talk about is the need to start redefining success in terms of the stories that we are able to tell. We've talked about that a lot this weekend. There are a couple of, they call themselves the old men in this picture, John and Joy, and they are one of the many stories that I've got to tell about the Abbey. They are a gay couple. They've been together almost 40 years, which is amazing. They are very Catholic, not Anglo-Catholic. They are Catholic. They are still Catholic, they tell me. Although, when the last time our bishop came to visit, during the peace, we had a confirmation, and during the peace, they came up with arms waving, wanting to be received into the Episcopal Church. So that was really a magical moment for us. Or the story that I heard told to me by one of my EFM students who is a therapist in Alabama. And she said she is working with an unnamed person who is transgender. And she was asking this person if they are religious in any way. And they said, well, no, I hate church. But I drink coffee at this coffee shop called the Abbey all the time. And the Episcopalians, they are okay. But how do we get the established church to accept our stories as a measure of success? I don't quite have an answer to that yet, but that's what this conference is about, right? How do we get our stories to become a measure of success? There's a little inset in that quote from Luke 10 that I was mentioning earlier, the one about don't move around from place to place, stay in one house, eating and drinking whatever they provide, for the laborer deserves to be paid. I think there's some people in our diocese that would beg to differ with that, and not in any kind of malicious way. But I'm interested to hear some of your experiences as missioners and some of the people on this panel. There are missioners out probably in this group and out in the Episcopal Church and in other denominations who we see making half, a third, a fifth of what the cardinal rectors in our big established churches are making. And this came up in a question yesterday, but what about money? And it really is. I mean, it is a big deal that one of the things that this conference and we need to be working on is how do we help the church prioritize this work that we are doing? And how do we help them see that it is important and that it is biblical? And got sort of lots of head nods when I said, we're missing a whole generation here. And we're going to start to feel that, both spiritually but also monetarily and financially. And that's one of these hard questions that we really have to think about. In my diocese in Alabama, one of the things that we are working on is establishing an Iona school for ministry, so a school that will train bivocational and non-stipendiary priests. And one of the things that I think has to really go along with that, as we're looking at commissioning people and sending people out to do both the work of the church and support themselves in some other way, is do we have in the Episcopal Church the theology of mission that will help hold those people up? Do we have a theology of mission that will help them do what they are doing and not feel taken advantage of, and not feel used up? At the moment, the priesthood is a very professional profession. It's a professional vocation. We expect to graduate from seminary and make a reasonable, if not wonderful, full-time salary. And one of the things we are looking at the Abbey, and hopefully our diocese uses us as an experiment on, is how are we, how in the 21st century are we reimagining and redefining what the priesthood and the diaconate and the lay orders of ministry really look like? And what does it mean for the priest and the deacon to be burning our hands on a steam wand and making coffee and serving that? And doing what looks like a secular profession, but in a spiritual way. You all got this card, of course. And one of the things that this advisory group on church planting is looking at is not only how to pay the laborer, although that's part of it, but also how do we lift up people that are doing this really hard ministry, and offer them other resources and dignity as well. And then, and then finally, sort of the last piece of cost that we got into yesterday as well, is how do we allow for failure? How do we allow for failure? When we first started conceiving of the Abbey, there were some members of my bishop's office who described it to me this way. Katie, we really want to set up a new church in the Avondale community, but we're pretty sure it's going to fail, and so we would like to do that cheaply. And in fact, the way that it was first described to me, and where Stuart was part of this at the conception too, was let's make it a church without walls, because walls are expensive. So let's not have them. But even more so, the idea was let's do this. Let's do the work of mission. We know it's important, but let's not risk too much. Let's not risk too much money. Let's not risk too much of our reputation. Let's not risk too much of all these things that I've talked about because we're afraid. Because we're afraid to fail. I'm afraid to fail. My husband can tell you that there have been nights since the Abbey was sort of born and opened that I just get up in the middle of the night and tell him, hey, I need to go worry for a while, and then come back to bed. It's really hard work. And luckily, I will tell you that if the Abbey fails, it's going to have been really expensive. is going to have been really expensive financially. It will have been really expensive with my sanity, and it will go out with fireworks. But I think that that's part of what God calls us to do, is to take chances and to take risks. And if it goes out to go out spectacularly, it's not going to fail, right? But, and I'm going to go back and refer one last time to this thesis that I wrote with Dr. Ye on the speeches and the Acts of the Apostles. And it was fortunate that this was one of our readings at the beginning of the Eucharist. Of course, we had Luke, and he talks about, when you enter a town and they don't accept you, know when the right time is to wipe the dust off your sandals and take off from there. There's also this incredibly powerful speech, right, in Acts 17 maybe, where Paul is up at the Areopagus in Athens. And I mean, it's the one that we all remember, that we all can quote something from, right? The statue that is to the unknown God, and Paul preaches powerfully and passionately. And at the end of the speech, which we didn't read, some scoffed, and several others said, "Oh yeah, like if you're ever back in Athens, we'll listen to you again." It's a very very millennial answer, guys. Yeah, if you come back, we'll come back and see you. And there are only 2 people that are converted and baptized. Only 2. And I remember Dr. Ye, a professor of the New Testament, said, this speech was a failure. This speech was a failure. And yet it's Paul's most spectacular speech. It's where so much of our theology of mission comes from. And we've got to be willing, if we're willing to go out and give Peter's speech, right, in Acts 2 and convert 2,000 people, we've also to be willing to go out to the Areopagus in Athens and give equally as powerful a speech and convert no one. But we scatter our seeds, wherever they may be. Whether that's expensive or whether that's cheap, whether that's, risky. And so my closing advice to you all is to remember that good church is never fast, cheap, or easy.